chug, 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 chug,
Hello and welcome back to The Wizard Staff. I'm your host Blake.
And I'm Guy.
And we are two drug novices who like to talk about EDH. We do drink and swear, so you've been warned. Please drink responsibly when playing children's card games. Tonight we are joined with a reoccurring guest, actually. I think, Guy, is this the first guest we've had back on since their first appearance?
This is the first guest that we've had back on and have had again. He loved it so much.
I'm special.
Yeah, it's my friend Parke. For any long-time listeners, you were on in episode 15 of Stacks 101. Yeah, does that feel like a long time ago?
Yeah, I didn't know what the fuck.
Yeah.
I've just gotten so much better, like, stacksy shit since then.
Oh, I know.
I was a baby boy.
Yeah. So, tonight, well, I kind of want to, like, has anything really changed since, like, you were last on? I'm going to just, like, especially some people who, like, didn't know you the first time around, like, what's your favorite card? Or cards?
Well, my favorite card just hasn't changed since then.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess one thing has changed about it. It's fucking banned.
Yeah, it's banned now.
Paradox Engine. It's still Paradox Engine. I still think it just enables so many cool things to happen. I think it's just such a fun, unique card. Don't you play your stupid violin?
I'm playing a silent fiddle.
Fiddle?
Yeah. Violin. I don't play instruments. I sing.
But Paradox Engine, I still think, is one of the cooler cards that exists in Magic. It's a nice utility tool that you can splash into a lot of decks. It enables a lot of cool things to happen. And what the rule committee seems to get wrong is you don't just put it in every single deck. Yes, you want rocks in a lot of decks, but Paradox Engine doesn't break those.
Not really.
It's a powerful card that should be built around to really break it and abuse it. But we can get there. We'll get there later.
Maybe one day.
Paradox Engine, still a super cool card. Still one of my favorites. Still have it at max rarity, and one day maybe we'll get unbanned.
Yeah.
But yeah, besides that, I had 6 decks. I've taken 2 of them apart since then, and I've revamped pretty much all but one of my other decks. Completely revamped a lot of them. So, yeah.
Do you have the the Kaladesh Invention Masterpiece for Paradox Engine, since it went significantly down after it got banned?
I made sure to pick that up, because, instead of getting it at like 120 or whatever the Masterpiece was before it got banned, after it got banned I said, nah, fuck it, picked it up for $30. And if it gets unbanned, when and if, in like Prophet of Krufix, I'm going to be a happy boy.
Alright, so that's your MTG Finance tip for the day. Pick up as many of those as you can for the future, and then you'll make bank.
Also, we need to talk about what we're drinking. Guy?
Yeah, I am not drinking the same thing as you guys, but I am returning to an old favorite.
Guinness.
Tricera hops.
Oh, okay.
Wow. I know I'm that predictable, but returning to Tricera hops, I felt like, something a little more classic beer tasting. It's pretty good. Just went down to my Whole Foods, picked one up. One's enough to get me drunk. It's like a double bottle kind of thing. So, thumbs up.
2 for 1 value. All right.
2, sure. They started selling the Delirium Tremens thing downstairs too, which is pretty cool. I remember I had to go out of my way to get that when we did the Theros set review, and I had to go buy it from Fabian's grocery store, but now I can just go down and get it whenever I want. But yeah,
convenience. Yeah.
What are you drinking today, Blake?
First martini, and are made by you, so
yeah.
It's pretty good.
Simple dry martini with vodka and dry vermouth. And I, of course, opened up the liquor cabinet and forced you to take 2 shots with it.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting the 2 shots before this, but we're doing it. We've done it. It's happening, so.
You needed it. Shut up.
Yeah.
You were like,
Parke,
one
are
shot,
you a
I feel good about
bartender?
It. I do bartending for fun. I like my hobbies to be cheap, like Magic the Gathering and alcohol. It's a genius idea.
I sense the sarcasm.
It's okay.
The alcohol in me kind of told me, yeah, those are pretty cheap, I guess.
Just play Popper and, buy bottom shelf liquor from Walmart.
Yeah, buy R&R or something.
So what's our topic tonight, boys?
Oh yeah, because we haven't talked about that yet. We are talking about primers.
It's prime time.
Yeah, so, but what's a primer?
I don't know, what is it?
Yeah, Blake, what is it?
Okay.
You're the
loaded
one who's kind of
question,
leading
man.
the episode.
I'm seriously the one leading this? Alright, well, okay, so a primer is essentially a guidebook about how to pilot a deck. It's often accompanied with a deck list, and then you scroll down to the bottom, and people have paragraphs explaining how to play and operate a particular deck. Think of a primer as it's like the first layer of paint that prepares you for like later layers of paint. Your primer should give a basic understanding that would allow the reader to feel comfortable learning more on their own thoughts, further reading and goldfishing and whatnot.
And then you can build up on top of that, such as you have with primer paint.
Yes.
Pretty much if you've been to like Architect or Tapped Out, you've seen a primer, even if it's a pretty, sparse one. There's a lot of options. You can just check it out, see what people think about their decks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll be talking about our primers a little bit later into this episode, but we're gonna work up to it, right?
Work up to the shameless plug, yeah.
Yeah. You got to do that sometimes. That's what I'm just realizing. You just got to be like have no shame in
Oh
anything.
hell yeah, dude! Just embrace me. No shame.
Oh god.
There's a reason I gave you 2 shots, buddy.
Yeah.
Finish your drink.
Oh god. Here we go.
Chug, 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 chug. Ayy.
That's the sound of regret, people.
So much. So a primer. Okay, like what's more specifically like what's in a primer? You talk about key cards, main synergies, win cons, notable exceptions, notable inclusions, really odd choices like specific cards that seem odd to like the average deck of its kind. There's the history of the deck list, like explain across the span of like many years the deck may have changed different archetypes or main strategies depending on what cards have come out through across the years. There's also the expected gameplay patterns of the deck. There's mulliganing, keeping opening hands, strengths and weaknesses, and then there's also like budget options for the decks. When you build a primer, it should always be built as if it's the most expensive version of the deck, assuming you have no budget, generally. And then those are like the main categories I'd say when writing a primer, but there's lots more you can do. But that's kind of how you start off with it. Moving forward, we have mostly all primers are for CEDH, generally speaking, because it's just, when you are primers, how would you explain it?
I feel like it's something that you traditionally think about like competitive EDH when you're writing a primer, because a lot of people, if you're going to write a deck list, refine this list, and then think about the deck so much that you actually like write a list about it, right, explaining every single thought that goes behind the deck, it's probably going to be a fairly competitive list. That said, you can actually find a lot of primers for more casual builds that can explain kind of the opposite of what you're talking about. Instead of it being from the most expensive mindset, a fairly budget list. You can have a budget primer, you can have like a mid-range primer that explains, I would include these decks or these cards if I had a better budget. These are some like improvements you can make to the deck, but this is how I currently play it with these limitations. It's essentially just, explaining what a deck is, how it works, without ever having to sit down at a table and watch it.
Mm-hmm. You can convey a lot more information reading at your own leisure this primer than, say, watching a deck tech video or in person, and you only have 5 minutes to talk about it.
If you compare it to a deck tech video,
yeah,
those are, you want to keep it limited. You want to have your nuance, you want to go over the main key points. And you do that with a primer too, but because it's written out, you can go a little bit slower. You can hit every single point of detail. Like, you and I, we both have primers in which we describe the point of basically every single card. You put them in categories. In one of my primers, I literally explain why every single card is in the deck.
Yep, that's funny.
But yeah, you're allowed to go further in depth. You're allowed to explain your thoughts, the gameplay patterns, specific combos, or why cards are included. It's just a nice way to explain why this deck is good, why somebody should play it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you really also gotta throw your own personal voice into it, and like have voice of the author to be like, yeah, like you should be pumped about this. Mm-hmm. Like you kind of do have to like really upsell this commander and the deck.
At the end of the day, you're writing a persuasive argument, going back to like, English classes. It is.
Yeah, it is.
You're convincing somebody, why is this deck not only worth reading about, but why should somebody build it? Hypothetically, you're writing it from the point of like somebody who is interested in this deck, this playstyle, and they want to play it. And to play it, you'd have to build it. So why is this worth them playing building?
Blake can attest to this, but during English class, and I both had it together, but our teacher was like, I know that lunch is next period. If you need to eat something small, go ahead, have a quick snack. But I took that as an invitation as to eat my whole fucking lunch every single day during English class, and I did not do well during English class. So
you passed.
I passed, but
what a nice
I wouldn't
part.
say I'm the strongest writer myself.
I mean, I was eating lunch with you.
And that's another thing to remember. Yeah. Always have an editor.
Yeah. Getting back on track. Most primers are usually like well written, and at the end of the day are like also supposed to be like really educational, right? Like
in theory, yes.
In theory, yeah.
I mean, do you trust the average person?
No.
No, exactly.
Okay, I was going to kind of beat around the bush there, but yeah.
No. Straight to the point. Hypothetically, yeah, your primer should be well written, cohesive, concise, and be able to convey a strong argument and a good point to it. But a lot of people don't.
Yeah.
Because writing's hard.
Yeah. I mean, we will get like later on into this episode why, there's some primers that you can like look for the red flags and be like, this is a bad primer. I can spot it within 5 seconds of looking at it. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. Moving forward, like generally, at least the conventional wisdom that I personally have found is that primers are like usually like 1,500 words, because anything less...
Well, it's not really a primer. It's more just like, this is a general synopsis of the deck, where a primer is supposed to be more in depth.
Yeah, and like you can write more than 1,500 words. That should also scale to how complicated like the deck is. And you also don't want to go to the other extreme and write so much that you begin to lose your audience.
I feel that.
In a drowning of information.
Right. I mean, if you're only going to write like maybe 200 or 300 words, do you really know your deck that well?
Yeah.
Probably not.
And more importantly, if you're only going to write 200 to 300 words and you can't think of more to say, I mean, you might not just be the kind of person who's supposed to write a primer. At that point, you might just not have the chops for explaining why this works the way it does. Because there's a lot of nuance that goes into a 100-card deck, even if, you ignore, 20 basic lands, 30 basic lands.
Yeah.
That's still 70 cards, and they're all there for a reason. And if you can't explain that very well. So yeah, you want at least a little bit of substance.
Yeah. Well, this kind of is now well, we might as well just bleed into the next topic of
straight to the point.
Yeah, straight to the point. How do you spot a bad primer? You're curious. You want to see oh, I want to build this commander. I want to know how to every intricate detail of it first, though. Or you have this commander, but you want to see what other people are doing. What's the best, air quotes, most tuned version of this deck? Let's read a primer. So you go in, you search it up on Google or whatever, and you the first 5 pop up, and you open them all in some tabs. You start looking at it. What are some red flags that you're looking for? And the first one that I look at is is it what we've been talking about? Is it less than 1,500 words? Because if it is less, they probably don't actually know what they're talking about. They don't. They just don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. Substance matters. But I feel like that's one of the more obvious things you can start with. If you want to get a little bit more in depth, you actually have to read through what they're saying instead of just looking at the amount of that's there. So if you see a ton of weird errors, grammatical errors, you read it and it feels just off,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably a sign. You don't want your audience to read this and be like, more focused on the grammar, the actual writing style, than the substance there. So it's not only bad grammar, but if it's like a little too embellished.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be reading poetry and trying to actually decipher what somebody is saying.
That is actually a good point that I didn't think about. I have read a lot of primers that, like, these people will just, like, what are the words I want to use? Like, they just have, like...
English major?
Like, no, it's just, like, they just have such an ego, and, like, they try to, like, be all poetic, and it's not. And it's, like, God, it just sounds like you have your head up your own ass.
Oh, yeah.
And it's, like...
You can do the metaphor. Like, have a nice little theme and overarching, like, you know, I'm going to connect it to the title of the primer. But don't make it so every other sentence
You have
has
to decode, and, like, it's not Shakespeare.
No.
God.
You're writing about a card game. Like, calm down, buddy.
Right, it's not like that one meme where it's like, oh, your English teacher asks, like, why are the curtains purple? The curtains are just purple. Shut the fuck up. Like, don't worry about it. You don't want to be, like, that analytical about it. You just want to be pretty straight to the point, because I think, as we said earlier, like, we don't trust most people. And we just want them to get what we're trying to say.
Yeah. Gosh, golly gee.
Let's all take a drink.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We're...
Should I break out the liquor?
Yeah, break out the liquor. We got time.
Regret time.
Yeah. No. Another way to spot a bad primer right away is if it's missing one of those key categories that we were talking about earlier. Like, if it just doesn't talk about, like, how to, like, keep an opening hand, or, okay, maybe that one's not as important, but, like, if it doesn't talk about, like, the win conditions, like, you should probably be like, what the fuck? Like, what are you even doing here? If it doesn't talk about, like, the key, most important, super synergistic cards, you should probably be like, okay, this person doesn't know what they're doing, and I should just move on.
It also depends on the list quite a bit.
You think so?
Yeah, I mean,
What do you mean?
if you're writing a combo primer, you really should have a section that goes over a variety of combos or, like, your main lines.
Mm-hmm.
If you're writing a Voltron, you know, primer, what kind of things do you need there? You probably should explain how you're going to win with Voltron, how you're going to protect your, you know, main game plan, etc.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going for an aggro deck, you should go with, like, what are tempo lines, and that's where you should really emphasize things like opening hands. If you're playing a fast deck, you really need to know what are the early lines of play going to be.
Yeah, especially if it's the more of the CDH decks, you definitely want to talk about opening hands.
Yeah. And then when you transition to a little bit more of a relaxed, casual deck, it's more of a, here's a general things you want to be doing within the first few turns, anywhere between 1 and 4. Here's your general plan, because your game's going to go much longer.
Okay, this is at least something that I personally run into. I think this can actually pertain to, like, all of our decks, right? That we made primers for, and it's the issue of, you know, someone has this casual... Okay, what am I trying to say here? It's someone who takes... Okay, maybe it doesn't apply to you, Parke.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so it takes
You think your deck's CEDH, but it isn't.
Yes,
Oh.
that's basically what I'm, like, trying to dance around.
God,
It's
I was
like,
wondering what that meant.
yeah, it's like you just, like, you want it to be CEDH, but it's not. Like, you just keep trying to, like, force cards to make it as fast as possible, like, as low mana curve as possible. Like, you just aren't going to get there.
So what you're saying is your deck should be a 7 out of 10?
No, get out of here with that shit.
I mean, I recognize in my primer that Purpose could never actually, like, go toe-to-toe with a CEDH deck. It's gonna be, like, a hard, like, 7.5 on the power scale, but it's not gonna be able to, like, actually win by turn 4. Like, no matter what.
Oh yeah,
Like,
and one of my primers is for Kozilek, who's a 10 mana colorless creature. You can never win a CDH pod with something that's 10 mana, colorless, and a fragile, like, 5-piece combo deck. Even for the most complicated thing that I'm currently working on for a Tashar primer, which is mono white and actual CDH viable, I will mention, don't expect this to always win against tier 1 and 2 commanders, because it's off meta. It's very off meta.
Mm-hmm.
Just because something is capable of CDH doesn't mean it can keep up the big boys, and most decks that are tuned can't keep up with CDH, like, at all. Even, like, niche fringe decks.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't think any of us really wrote a CDH primer. I think we wrote our primers to the best of the ability we can take something that isn't meta, that can sit down in a pod and do well.
But I think Blake's point is like, I have read primers about Purphoros where they're like, this is a CEDH build, and I'm like, no, it really isn't.
No.
Like, this isn't going to be able to like that kind of route and like do well in.
Yeah.
Unless if your CEDH is like what we would all, everyone else would consider like a 7 out of 10 or something.
It's all about perspective,
So-
yeah.
I think that's the point Blake is trying to make, is just if your commander can't actually be CEDH, but you're trying really hard to say, no, it is totally, 100%.
You're just lying to yourself. And it also pains me because it's like the people that write these sorts of primers clearly have put in a lot of time and effort. They are often very long. You can tell they care about the deck, but it's just like, this is just such wasted effort and energy. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, man. Like, it's just not going to be CEDH.
Yeah, to write a primer, you have to be passionate about a deck. You have to be passionate about the commander. Sometimes you look at these primers and you're like, wow, this is through such rose-tinted glasses.
Yeah.
It's like going to American Idol and then Simon Cowell says it's a no for me.
Yeah. It's like when the judges start laughing, you know there's something bad.
Because they're probably not laughing with you.
No, they never are.
No.
They never are.
So I figured we'd now kind of talk about each of our primers a little bit. And we'd start off with you, Parke, letting you have the most time to talk about your primers.
Oh, good golly gosh.
Yeah.
Well, the first primer I wrote is for Chainer Dimension Master, the Chainer that everyone seems to forget about, because every time I say, oh, you know, my commander's Chainer, they're like, oh, you mean the new one? It's like, no.
No.
The one that's mono black that, you know, came out Tempest?
Really long ago.
Yeah. 20-year-old card and, like, fighting the foil killed me, but irrelevant.
Mhm.
It's a primer for a deck that, again, not CEDH, but powerful. If you play this deck to its full potential, it will be able to do very well at your average table, and it's, I don't know, I personally think it's interesting enough that I wrote a primer on it. So, where do I even start with this?
Well, do you want to just go through like the main categories of your like primer?
Yeah. I guess this brings up a good point, especially if you're on like Tapped Out or Architect, you can make custom categories basically. Instead of organizing things by land, artifact, planeswalker, creature, etc., you can have different subcategories. For one of my primers, I did organize into subcategories, the other I didn't. Chainer being the one where I didn't. For Chainer, I just explain, here's your commander, use your artifacts, your creatures, your instants, your sorceries, and to be honest, going back, I probably will come back and reorganize them to their own categories because I think it's a little bit easier to understand why cards are in these certain categories. But you start off, this one was pretty straightforward. A nice little intro, a basic synopsis of what the commander does and why it's interesting. Why would you play Chainer? Because it's a really interesting way to play mono black. It's a very flavorful way to play mono black because you're sacrificing life and mana, which you have an abundance of, to get massive resources reviving things.
Yeah, starting at 4 life really helps, doesn't it?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want it to ever go down to 20 life. That's silly. So yeah, I started off with a nice little synopsis and then immediately go into, is this deck right for you? Because I enjoy combo decks and I know a lot of people don't.
Yeah.
This is an especially grindy kind of deck. It runs a lot of hate cards, it runs a lot of cards that people hate.
Like what?
Oh, you know, Contamination, it runs Infernal Darkness, it runs Trinisphere, it runs a ton of things, and if I had an extra just $300 lying around, I would just pick up a Chains of Mephistopheles, because that's a fun card. It's not about if your opponents are having fun, it's about if you're denying them resources in an interesting way and putting up a giant wall that makes it hard for them to play, but not impossible. So yeah, from there, I go on, explain the game plan, what we're using our commander for, explain our win conditions, and from there going into the actual combos. Because it's a reanimation deck, you run Buried Alive and, you know, half a dozen different ways to tutor in general. You've got a ton of options, so I just explained, it's a combo deck, you have a ton of ways to play this. Here's your main cards that can be used for the combos, here's the combos I use most often. But pay attention to this dozen other different cards, because you have them on the board or in your graveyard, you have a ton of ways to utilize them.
Do you think you should play Chainer if you can't do math quickly?
No.
In your head?
No, God no.
What were some of the difficulties that you found while you were writing your primer, trying to explain to someone why they should or shouldn't play Chainer, or if, you know, talking about combos? So just what were some of the things that you may have found difficult?
Well, for a combo deck in particular, I mostly play combo decks. I'm very well versed in combo decks.
Yeah.
And I play fast. During my opponent's turns, I'm just constantly thinking about how am I going to next do my plays, or if I draw into this card, or what am I missing to make a combo happen into doing something big and spectacular. So I really had to think about, like, from the perspective of my opponents, what do they think is cool? What do they really not enjoy? And based off some of the feedback that I've gotten, aka, eyes rolling, people sighing, people getting frustrated, you have to remember all of the bad times that go with people playing against your deck versus just playing your deck.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a combo deck. It runs Staxy cards, it runs hate cards, it runs forced sacrifice to discard, all sorts of things that people will tilt over. I literally explain, sometimes you play Mesmeric Fiend, you sack him in response to it being cast, and you just look at somebody's hand, have them reveal it to the entire table, and you exile cards from it. People don't like that. But it's a deck that embraces that. And you have to find your audience. Because at the beginning of the primer, when I explain, are you going to like this deck or will you not? You just gotta be honest. If I'm not trying to sell a product that you're not gonna like, if you don't like combos, if you don't like the idea of having a couple lines that you're trying to reach and having a grindy playstyle built around that, you should probably just go find another deck for you.
Blake, are you a combo player?
I'm really not. I don't think so. Except for maybe Una. That's my only real combo deck, I think.
Yeah.
You think so? Yeah. So anyway.
So Blake's kind of a combo player, but so my question was going to be, after you wrote your Chainer primer, did you give it to someone like Blake and say, hey, can you read this and does it make sense to you, to get the perspective of whether or not someone who isn't a combo player could understand what you're trying to say?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I did send it to Blake and actually a couple other people who looked over it and said they made some comments, they suggested some changes, some inclusions, some removals.
And I was a little bit biased because it's I have played against this, so I'm okay, these lines make sense because I lose to them all the time. Yeah. So,
but it is important to just, you have to explain, you're not just explaining to people who are veterans of EDH, but you're explaining to people who are new to EDH and they want to play a mono black deck, they want to play a, Voltron Commander, they want to play something that's cool, that they find interesting, they click on your deck, they read the primer, and you want them to not be confused. You want to explain things, not as if they're stupid, but just in a way that is very easy to approach.
It's a fine balance where you don't want to speak on such a high level that they're not going to understand what the hell you're saying, but you can't dumb it down so much that you're not clear and concise about what needs to be done.
Exactly.
It's a balance.
So yeah, my deck explains the combos, explains the early to mid game, your general plays, cards you want to look for, keep in hand, and then in this deck in particular, I explained a couple feels bad cards that even when I personally cast them, I've got a fairly spike-ish mindset, I hold back on because, when you cast, Contamination, Pox, Chain of Smog, Mind Slicer, people are always going to react negatively. And you have to understand that that's taking advantage of what you have. Especially since I play a lot of monocolored decks, I'm limited in what I have. I don't have the options of splashing in the best cards of every color. I have to use what's given to me, and Mono Black isn't super fast. It has access to amazing tutors, but I have to slow everybody else down to take advantage of it. So when I cast a turn 3 Oppression or an early Trinisphere, I just gotta accept that, this is the game plan that I've chosen. That said, it's a fine line between doing the best play and understanding the pod you're in.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of times where in this deck I run Contamination and Infernal Darkness, and they just stay dead in my hand because I don't want to be that guy at every table who just plays the card that says, you can't play, you have no responses to this, I'm going to pass the next 3 turns and then win, while you sit there sighing, looking at me with just death in your eyes and say, pass. After explaining that, it's always good to really just be honest about your deck. I go and I explain why I excluded certain cards. Some cards, like Machias the Unhallowed, I explain it's just preference. I don't think it's very interesting. I like at least more depth to my combos than a lot of 2-card combos. And then you really gotta explain, there's a lot of bait cards in EDH
Yeah.
We've got like 20,000 cards available to us, and you shouldn't be running Phyrexian Arena in your deck. So you have to really just make sure...
Well, not at the speed that you're going at.
For slower decks, yes, but I explain cards like Phyrexian Arena, cards that I think are subpar.
Like, yeah, so you go through all of these, like exclusions, like Phyrexian Arena, Jet Medallion, Exsanguinate, and you give like a short paragraph on each of them.
Yeah, and it's like, is this excluded because of preference? Is this excluded because of power? Is this excluded because of X, Y, or Z? You have to make sure you have a compelling argument and one that is understandable, because when you start talking about things you're not including, that's when it can get really shaky. After I explain all that, just a nice little final thoughts, a summary, just like, make sure you keep these in mind. I know you went a little bit more depth in your primer about things that you should look out for, but you just want to give a general idea and end it with a positive start. End it with something strong, conclude it with something strong that can tie back into the intro, just like they teach you in your English classes.
Yeah.
It's just about good writing in addition to knowing your deck and being able to explain it well.
I feel like that's a pretty good consensus, and we will link all of these, by the way, in the description of these episodes in the show notes. So feel free to take a look at them, like as we're talking, and even afterwards. Do you want to, well, since you're on a roll, Parke, do you want to talk about your other one, or would you like one of us to talk about one of our decks?
Let's break it up a little.
Break it up a little bit?
Yeah,
all right.
One of you boys.
All right, well...
I can go, because I feel like I'm going to probably have the least amount to say.
Okay.
Because I'm like that kid, he was told like 3 weeks ago that, you know, hey, you're going to have to write this paper. And he's like, okay. And then like the night before, he doesn't even have his rough draft ready. Okay, let's start. And then like the rough draft is actually, you know, the final draft. Yeah. So, because 24 hours ago is when I wrote, 24 hours of when recording this is when I wrote my primer. And I did pretty much kind of go off of these notes that we had written. And I was trying to like hit the criteria. You know, just kind of like when you're in English class and it's like, all right, here's what you need. Here's what you need to explain. And I'm like, okay, did I hit this? Okay. Did I hit that? Okay.
I'm at least going to get a C on this.
Check.
Having a nice little checklist, just hit the basics.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And like, you know, it's not all the way there, but like, you know, it's got like the fundamentals and it's a start. I definitely plan to like go back and maybe explain a little more. And I already know, like, you know, just the format of it is a little off, but I was just learning how to.
Oh yeah, I just want to say, like, also if the primer says it hasn't been updated in like 3 to 5 years, probably don't look at it.
It's like even a primer that hasn't been updated in like 5 months immediately loses a lot of credibility to me. So it's kind of a pain. You have to upkeep it. You have to at least pay attention where it's like, if a good card for your color or changes to the format happen, like. There's so many primers I read that say, oh yeah, here's your main combo. You use Paradox Engine. And it's like...
That's so true.
And then, you know, if you're playing like, yeah, a monocolor deck, you might not include it, but if you're playing mono blue nowadays, and you don't run Fastest Oracle in it, and your game plan is to deck out, then you lose a lot of credibility, so you do have to keep up with it.
Do you think, though, even if like there's cards that came out, but you're like, I don't think any of these could actually fit into it because it's such like a niche strategy, should you at least talk about like some of the more recent cards and why you don't include them?
Yeah, and that's why I like to include a section that's about things that aren't included. Because
Okay.
I think that actually can bring a lot to the light, just explaining, you know, it's not just about what's good, it's about what you're not including.
Yeah, like I like to think of, and this works with a lot of things in life, half of explaining of what something is explaining what it's not.
Okay, but back to me, you know, back to basics. So I chose to write my first primer about Purphoros just because I feel like it's the most, other than Jace, who is just so linear in his strategies, Purphoros is a little more, he can go a couple different routes with how he wins. I mean, he wins by the obvious, like, oh, you're just going to do burn damage to all your opponents. But there's a couple different routes where you can take, whereas my Jace deck was like, tutor for Walking Ballista. That's it. I wrote the Perforos primer kind of just trying to get ready for today, and I did not hit the 1500 mark, so mine could be considered a bad primer at the moment.
Shame. No.
But I mean, if that's like the only thing that's like, you know, what's making a quote-unquote difference between a good and a bad primer, then oh, sue me. I haven't also given my primer to either of you as like, you know, hey, does this make sense? Which is something that you should probably just do in general whenever you want to like make something. It's not also like, you know, you would write a screenplay or a book and then, hey, I'm just gonna, you know, go to town on this and get no one else's opinion because you want to make sure that it makes sense to someone.
And it's nice having connections when you're writing a primer because, I mean, I know you linked me your primer because I tend to enjoy editing and I took a lot of English classes, but like you sent me your primer and I spent like 3 hours just going line by line being like, you can do this little adjustment, change this, keep this consistent. Like you said earlier, just showing it to other people and having them get feedback, like real honest feedback, can do a ton. And then if you know somebody who can edit, even better.
I'd say it's almost mandatory because like you just like it's really actually easy to get tunnel vision when writing a primer, and like you just, you know, you're so close to something you can't actually see the big picture. So I think it's really important to like have other people to like review your stuff.
Plus, with any other writing assignment, you don't know what you do habitually until somebody points it out. Is there a word that you use every other sentence and you don't need to use it? You probably shouldn't include that in something that you're going to publish online, which you want people to look up
Take
to
you
as a
seriously.
reference.
Yeah, that's a big thing that I have had to edit other people's like essays during college, and something that like bothers me that was only pointed out to me until one of our English teachers pointed it out was he was like, oh, you're using I as the beginning of your sentence for like 6 sentences in a row. Change it up. And I was like, okay. So that's always something that I also tend to look out for how I'm writing, or when someone asks me to edit something, I'm like, okay, you need to be a little more, you need to create more variance on how you're writing, just so I can find it a little more engaging rather than you just saying like, I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this. I don't have a ton I want to say on my primer just yet, just because still working, and I think Blake and I will each do like our own episode on our primers in the future. You two are now welcome to look at it and then roast me. I'll cry about it for a week and then I'll get back to work. It's a tough love.
So we're going to move on to my Kozilek primer, and like I said earlier, you want to be passionate about a deck that you're going to write a primer on, and
It's probably the most passionate I've seen you about any deck.
yeah, because this is my oldest deck. This is the first EDH deck I ever built, which was the first Magic deck I ever built. So I've been constantly updating this and editing this for a good portion of, 5 years?
Yeah.
And now this deck list is to the point where I'm pretty satisfied with it.
Do you think it's kind of a requirement in some way to have played the deck for at least maybe like a year, so you know how it's evolved, and like everyone builds their first deck being like, this is great, but then, you know, you play a few games and you're like, okay, here's the things that can change. It's not like you just build the deck and you're like, all right, here's the primer.
Oh yeah.
No, you...
Because, like, I don't know about you guys, I've switched 5 cards out in a deck, and then in the next 20 games, I see those cards maybe like 3 times.
You have to play a lot of games to see a new card.
You have to play hundreds of hours to really have a good understanding of a deck in its current iteration, to know its strengths and weaknesses. And like, I keep a journal of all of the games that I play. I write down everybody's decks that was in the game, and then I go and I write cards that I think are overperforming,
Parke keeps a
underperforming.
diary.
Oh yeah, Blake's seen it. It's organized, clean. It's just pretty much a journal of what is working, what isn't, how often is this winning, how often is this losing, what is it losing to, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses. And I think that really helped me a lot with my primer. I focused on what does the deck do well and what is underperforming, and those are the cards that I switch out. And cards that I switch out are cards that usually stay out, get replaced by something better, and then you have to test for another 100 hours to see if that card is performing as well as you want it to. So yeah, it's a lot of time. For me, it was 5 years before I was really satisfied enough to write a primer.
Yeah. I'd say, like, if you have never played a deck, you can make a deck list, but you have to at least goldfish a deck. I don't want to give a hard number, but you have to at least, like, play test it out in order to, like, actually write a primer.
That was gonna be what my question was, is how do you then go about testing that? Because I can't imagine you just play 100 hours of games with other people all the time. You probably do either goldfish, or you just sit at your desk and maybe you have 3 other decks that you play with that are like very different from it, and then you're like, okay, I'm gonna play 4 decks at once to kind of like see how this all plays out.
Yeah, it's a mix of a lot of things. I go out, I play against real people, but I can't do that nearly as often as I would like to. So, me personally, I have a program that I use, Tabletop Simulator. You can pick it up on Steam. I found pretty much every expansion of Magic, so I do a lot of my deck building, deck testing there, playing against either myself or other random people online, and you get a lot of the nuance because it doesn't show you all the rules like if you're playing an actual Magic program like Magic Arena. So I play a lot of decks against myself, I figure out the strengths and the weaknesses, I play against other people, and it's pretty much like that. You just have to play the deck a lot, you have to really test it, you have to be willing to admit that, like, this isn't working. And sometimes you have to do the hard cuts. You have to say, like, I love this card, but it's bad. It doesn't work as well as I want it to. Every time I've played it, I've just had it dead in my hand 9 games out of 10. And you have to do the hard part. Because me personally, I build my decks to be able to win the way that I want them efficiently, and I want to put up a challenge for other people. I don't play to pub stomp. I enjoy combos, but there are plenty of games where I just would rather, you know, hold back and make the games a lot more interesting, whatever that means. But yeah, when it comes to this deck, this is a list for Kozilek. I've spent 5 years on refining to the point that it is now. Like I was mentioning earlier with Chainer, I actually organized this one. It's not just the categories by card type, it's actually, here are cards that are utility cards. Here are the generic lands, here are the utility lands. Here's your cards that, you know, can do certain strategies that are broken in the deck. Here's the things that are crucial, here are your tutors, etc. And I think it really does a good job of explaining, like, what are your ratios? Okay, you want X pieces of interaction. What are the tutors you want? Oh, you want these tutors, here's some that are better than others, and here's some things that you can be flexible on. Like, for instance, Kozilek is colorless. You can use a variety of weird things, some good, some not. Me personally, I like combos that are kind of objectively bad.
Yeah, I guess that's an accurate statement.
Yeah. I like using incredibly powerful cards in synergy with a lot of just terrible, god-awful cards, which is why I'm sad Paradox Engine's banned. Because my ideal way to win with this deck is with Paradox Engine, a couple rocks, and Razor Boomerang, because Razor Boomerang is terrible. It's really bad, and that's super funny. But with this deck, I put a lot more personality into it, I'd say. I like to, you know, make jokes and not take things too seriously. And when I compare this to Chainer, it's a night and day difference. Chainer, I was being very serious, like, okay, here are the strengths, here are the weaknesses, here's the general game plan. Here, I at least put some personality, some flair into it. It's like, you know, not everything has to be just so straight and rigid. And I think it probably did a lot to help this deck and make it a little bit more interesting.
I saw one of your main win cons is apparently using Aladdin's ring.
Oh yeah. And I made sure to get it in foil.
It's a good
too.
card.
Yeah. For
No,
those
it's not.
unfamiliar,
It's a terrible card.
Aladdin's ring is an 8-mana artifact that you can then pay 8 mana to tap and then deal 4 damage to any target. Why do I run that? Because that is the least efficient way to deal face damage by tapping an artifact. I go along to explain in this primer, like, here's a variety of different options that are all better, but for style points, you do this. Because sometimes it's not just about, you know, you're not doing the most efficient thing, you're not playing
Gotta
CDH.
flex on them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We'll get to that. We'll get to the real flex. So, one thing that's really important, I think, especially if you're going with something more narrow like monocolored commanders, is explaining why this monocolor commander over other ones. So for Chainer, it's pretty unique because that's the only like good res effect that I can think of on a legendary creature. So I built the entire deck around that. Whereas with Kozilek, it's mostly there to draw you 4 cards and be a big threat with Annihilator 4 up on the battlefield. So one of the things that I get more than anything is people who say in person, when they see my commander, oh wow, a colorless commander, but why are you playing Kozilek the Butcher of Truth instead of Kozilek the Great Distortion? And it's been in and out of the command zone so many times over so many years, and just at the end of the day, I found this commander to be better, and I made sure to explain very in depth. I gave it its own like 3-paragraph section, just explaining this Kozilek is the reason that this deck works, and the other Kozilek is weaker because of these reasons. But if you prefer it, it's viable. You don't want to just completely shut people down, but you want to explain very well why it is the things that you do. Why do the things that you do the way you do them?
Because you really want that card draw.
Yeah. In this specific case, you drawing 4 cards is oftentimes the exact same, as, if not better, than drawing back to 7. Kozilek the Great Distortion, the counterspell effect is really just mind games more than anything. I find myself rarely ever having the right artifacts to discard. And most importantly, Annihilator 4 really makes people panic, makes them waste removal.
It does.
And you can politics so much off of that.
That's definitely true.
But yeah. So after I explained, why I picked the commander that I did, I explained how it worked. Because I was just thinking, over the years that I played this deck, I've had a lot of people who are a bit newer to the game who see my deck. They're like, oh, colorless commander, how does that even work? So you really have to think about the interactions that you have as a individual playing Magic. It's not just about, here's this deck, here's how I think it should be played. It's, here's this deck, here's how you should even approach thinking about this color in general, this color combination, this anything. You have to be very specific. And again, you don't want to insult your audience, you just want to be able to explain your arguments well. So, I explained the early mid-game. In this deck, it's a ton of ramp because you're using as many artifacts as you can because that's all you got. Make sure you're using mana rocks. This, much like Chainer, is another combo deck, but this one is a lot more intricate, a little bit more nuanced. You don't just cast Buried Alive and then win. You actually have to have a lot of setup, so you have to consider all the different things that you do. So I explain, I even use subsections. So it's, here's how you get infinite mana, here's how you end games, and the most important section is the style point section. Because as a weird, gimmicky combo player, I have figured out a way to take infinite turns in colorless. Because why not? And it's terrible. It requires using some god-awful cards. But it was interesting enough that I chose to include as a segment because it's about, expressing yourself. EDH in general is about how do you like playing the game? Because you don't have to play it the exact same as other people. You shouldn't just be out there net decking. You should be making individual changes to adjust how you like to play. And if you want to style with people, you want to just be completely swagger, walking in, taking infinite turns in colorless, and sacking your commander to just shuffle your deck back in, do it. I say absolutely do it. But yeah, this deck, I even go further in depth than my other decks, and I explain why every single card is in the deck. Everything from, your lands, why you should run those, utility lands, because in colorless you have a lot of options for utility, because I, only run 2 wastes in the deck. But some things are obvious, mana dorks. You run Soul Ring because you're in colorless and it's Soul Ring. But other things you have to be a little bit more specific. Why do I only run 3 cost discounters? Because I think these are efficient because of X, Y, and Z. The utility effects, I think they're good because they do this. Safety and interaction, you do this because of that. It's just about explaining in a concise manner, never more than a couple sentences, why you think this is the best fit for the deck. And I think that's really important when you're just trying to convince somebody that this deck is the best version that you can try. And then, yeah, just like with my Chainer deck, my Exclusions have a couple hot takes, some controversial opinions. Since, the first card that I list, Temple of the False God, I call just objective trash. Because it is. Fight me. It's about really finding the cards that work best for you. I say that some cards don't work for me, but I think you should try them out if they are cards that interest you, or this, that, and the other. And of course, if you have something that you're this passionate about, something so passionate about that you are willing to write an entire primer, you're allowed to have a hot take or two.
Yeah.
At the start of this episode, I said my favorite card is still Paradox Engine, yeah? So I decided, I'll write a nice 3-paragraph rant
About why.
about why Paradox Engine shouldn't be banned, why I think it is a powerful card that should exist in the game state, and more importantly, if it gets unbanned, what it can do for this deck.
Because it would really rework the deck, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah. Currently, one of the main things you want to do is tutor out things like Unwinding Clock or Shimmer Mirror, ways that can really just start breaking colorless. The Paradox Engine just lets you break it into a whole new level. But yeah, you're allowed to have something that's interesting, something that's going to grab somebody's attention. When you look at a deck list and you see a banned card in the sideboard, you're like, wait, that's banned. You scroll down, you see an entire segment dedicated to it, it's like, okay. A little weird, but sure. It's something that can gather the attention of people and make it worth reading. You want to have something
It's like a hook.
Yeah. Like any writing assignment, you want to have a good hook, something that engages people, makes them go like, ooh.
This entire episode is secretly like a pro-English class episode.
Don't major in it, just take the class.
Yeah.
I think I've explained enough. You just want to have a nice primer that explains things in depth, concise, to the point, but have fun with it. In this one, I use like an overarching metaphor. I explained it's like a steam engine because, a Rube Goldberg machine is overdone, and I wanted something that's synonymous with it. But it's like, have fun, have something that catches the eye of people, and just make sure that your primer is different than all the others. I mean, there's thousands, if not thousands, of primers that are out on the internet, so why should somebody read yours over somebody else's?
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that you have, going back to English, you got your ethos, your pathos, your logos, have your emotional appeal, and have your appeal to, I've been playing this deck for X many years, I think this is one of the better ways to run it, because reasoning. Explain your logic.
Yeah. Hopefully you have good reasoning.
Yeah, you have good reasoning.
Yeah. Alright. So, we're winding on down here, and I figured we'd finish on with our last primer of the night, and I'll be talking about my Sigarda Voltron Enchantress deck.
Yeah, enough of this combo shit.
Yeah, enough of this combo shit. We're gonna
noobs
we're
play
gonna
combos.
dial it back a little bit. So this
Power up.
Yeah, this is a deck I've been playing for about 4-ish years.
Mm-hmm.
I've been playing it almost every weekend, if not every other weekend. So I've played it quite a lot.
Oh yeah.
And so I start with what the general premise is. You're hitting people with Voltron commander damage. And then right at the beginning, I explain this is not CEDH. Most of the Sigarda primers out there are calling themselves CEDH, and I basically say, yeah, that might work 1 out of 300 games you'll win. But I don't think most players want to be doing that. I don't think people want that kind of win percentage. I think people would rather play a mid-tier build that's more solid and synergistic in that type of meta and win 1 out of 4 games, give or take. Mm-hmm. After getting that elephant out of the room, I kind of break down why you would want to play Sigarda and why you would not. It really just depends on who you are as a player and what you like to prefer. Parke, I don't really think you'd enjoy playing this deck because it's not really combo based. It's much more value and synergy and yeah. So I think that's one good example why you wouldn't. And it's not like you're bad or you're a better player. It's just you have a different style.
Yeah, everyone's allowed to have their own preferences.
Yeah. So then I go into opening hands because I found it relevant to talk about and the things that you look for to mulligan. And then I talk about the typical how to play. I literally break it down turn by turn because I played this enough. On the average, I just know okay, I want to be doing this turn, I want to be doing this that turn, and just knowing when to hit your key cards and effects. I actually talk about quite in depth the cards and strategies that hurt you because unfortunately there's a large number of them, but I feel I do a very good job of explaining the cards that help stop you. Like, the deck is very weak to counter spells, but I explain like Dragonlord Jamoka, Destiny Spinner, Grand Abolisher, your Cavern of Souls, your Vernal Equinox, and then these specific cards often come up in multiple categories, so your protection pieces against your weaknesses are often redundant, so it's very synergistic in that regards. So after talking about that for a while, I get into the notable exclusions, and most of the cards that are in the deck, either they're air quotes CEDH builds, or they are much less competitive. So this primer is a little bit weird, where like the deck is like in this middle zone. It's not quite CEDH, but it's not quite super casual. And then I do talk about the cards in this deck, but I do spend quite a fair amount of time explaining almost every other card that's not. Like, generally speaking, there's like about 300 cards across all Sigarda deck lists, and I explain like the 200-ish that aren't. And by process of elimination, you basically get to your best cards. And so I do that for a very like long amount of time, and then I get to your budget, because this deck is like over $2,000. It definitely does not need to be that expensive. And so I'm like, fuck.
You like your shiny
I
cards.
want people to read this and then be inspired to like build this in paper, or at least play this online. But if you do want to build in paper, like, fuck, nobody has that kind of money starting out. Like, especially for like a mid-tier deck, like, no one's gonna do that. So like, let's make a budget build of it. And so that's kind of my primer. And you know, I might add a category or two, but right now I'm feeling solid, as I'm sure you're feeling solid about your primers, Parke. Guy, we're going to be helping you out with your primer and giving you feedback, because we haven't really read it yet, but
Thank you.
yes, that's just kind of like how it be.
It do really be that way.
Yeah, it'd be like that sometimes. And so we have come to a close. We hope that you've all enjoyed listening to this episode about us talking about primers and then shamelessly plugging ourselves. Hooray. Guy, where
Don't we do that every episode?
No.
Yeah, but this is more...
Yeah. It's like a bit flavorful, right?
Sure, why not?
Yeah, I'm calling
Anything
it.
that justifies our decisions.
I'm calling it flavorful. Yeah.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Why
so, Guy, where can they find us?
Wow, you still haven't learned.
Maybe one day.
You can find us on YouTube, The Wizard Staff. You can find us on Twitter at TheWizardStaff101. Email us at TheWizardStaff101@gmail.com. We have a Facebook. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, and anywhere else that you listen to your podcasts. Give us a thumbs up, 5 stars, whatever. Just please leave us comments, say how much you like us or how much you hate us. We just love to see the interaction
Hell yeah.
between you guys.
Smash
So
that motherfucking like button.
Subscribe.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
Click that bell notification.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
Go away with that.
I think that's everywhere that you can find us.
Yeah. Thank you again, Parke, for being on this episode.
Yeah, thank you, Parke.
Yeah.
If you
All right.
angrily rant about the RC, just let me know.
All right, so we're going to sign off here. Peace out.
Peace out, Girl Scout.